Now, first of all, I want to make something very clear. This is not the launch of the MMCS. It's far too early for this. This workshop marks the beginning of a sector consultation process in which we're engaging with the industry to canvass opinion, ideas and support. So the aim of this workshop is to draw attention to the MMCS programme as an integrated approach to GDP compliance and continuous improvement for all the stakeholders in the pharma-logistics supply space. I think it's fair to say that the unprecedented market conditions we're all now subject to has resulted in lasting changes to the way we all work and to the needs and expectations from the supply and distribution chains that govern modern global business. So we're commencing market engagement at this stage simply because it is absolutely crucial with an industry-wide initiative such as this that its content accurately reflects the needs and priorities of its potential user base and other stakeholders. So as I've just said, this workshop is not the launch of the MMCS. It is a high-level introduction to the MMCS programme, presenting some background, scope and objectives to the project as a precursor to an official launch later this year. And at the end of this session, you'll be given a web link where you can register to be kept informed of the project's progress and vitally get the opportunity to be involved and/or share your knowledge, suggestions, ideas, etc. as you see fit. Okay, now I want to very briefly open with just a tiny bit of background on the current GDP regulatory framework, just for the benefit of those in the audience for whom this is not their normal day job. And I know there are a few of you out there. Now, Malik has already mentioned the EU Community Code Directive 83, which was issued back in 2001 as a framework for the harmonisation of the regulations relating to medicines, including the rules governing their distribution. As far as good distribution practice, GDP, is concerned, this built on the original EU GDP guidelines of 1994 and has culminated, amongst other things, in the revised EU guidelines of November 2013 for human medicinal products and the guidelines for APIs of March 2015. Next slide. However, although the EU guidelines that were introduced in 2013 have formed a template for many subsequent national regulations, even within the EU, the interpretation of GDP is open to wide interpretation. To a large extent, this is because firstly, GDP is necessarily non-prescriptive in nature, and secondly, the guidance has been enacted in the form of a community directive rather than a community regulation. And it is also interesting to note that the UDRA GDMP, UDRA standing for EU Drug Regulatory Authority, database currently lists no less than 378 national competent authorities. So you can see immediately the scope for interpretation and variance in the enactment and enforcement of the regulations just within the EU. So for now, there is no single global GDP standard, despite the harmonisation efforts of bodies such as ICH, the International Council for Harmonisation, the ECA, the European Compliance Academy, and PICS, the Pharmaceutical Inspection and Cooperation Scheme. There are literally dozens of national and regional GDP standards in operation around the world. And although most of these are similar and operate under MAH, that stands for Marketing Authorization Holder, and WDA, standing for Wholesale Dealer Authorization, type licensing systems, there is much difference when it comes to detail and enforcement. And although responsibility may be clear, accountability rests with the supply chain players. And just to give a very simple example, the time allowed for the temporary storage of products during distribution at holding nodes varies between different jurisdictions. For example, the last time I looked up that particular point, it was between 24 and 72 hours. So there is a large degree of interpretation of the rules. And on that note, I'm just going to pass over to Courtney, for our first poll.
Thank you very much, Alan. Hello, everyone. Courtney Soulsby here. Pleasure to be with you. I work for BSI, British Standards Institution, along with Angus Metcalf, who you met earlier. So off the back of that dialogue that Alan was just speaking about relating to responsibility, one of the areas that we want to try to start with engaging you from the forefront. Again, Alan has said this is all about the consultation with you as industry players. So the first poll question I hope is popping up on your screen now that says, how do you pass on the responsibility for GDP onto your logistics providers or onto your subcontractors that you may be using? I've seen in the industry a number of different mechanisms, I would say ranging best practice. First, of just simply putting it as a part of a contractual agreement. So making sure you have that Appendix Z in a contract that says you must follow GDP requirements. You may take it a next step, be more specific with option B, which is there's a specific SLA that was created around GDP for logistics providers to follow. One step further would be that ongoing audit or assessment of logistics providers to show compliance. So that's the ongoing monitoring that's in place there, or potentially that you actually require a GDP certificate to be achieved by all the logistics providers. So if you wouldn't mind guessing or suggesting based on your business options A through D as to how you manage GDP compliance down the supply chain, that'd be great. Looks like we've got some answers coming in. Good, good. Oh, quite a variety, in fact. So far we're seeing, I think, about 30% are requiring a certificate, and then 25% both for option B and option C around the SLA and ongoing audit. So a variety of mechanisms, which I think is one of the points as to why we're engaging in this exercise with you, is it does seem to be quite inconsistent about how GDP is passed down the responsibility. To Alan's point, accountability is hard to find. So what are some of the factors driving our change to embark on this type of program with you? Some of these you'll probably roll your eyes and say, yep, I know that. Of course, I'm experiencing this as a business. So one of them is around obviously poor consignment visibility and the lack of transparency generally within the industry. There's a siloed mentality, protectionism, saying that quality is a competitive advantage, and in actual fact, we're all working to achieve quality within the logistics supply chain together, I believe. As change happens within GDP legislation or guidance coming out from the WHO, I find that there isn't a wide-ranging training capability to increase competency within logistics network. It also can be tied, I think, GDP principles to sustainability and marking around carbon footprint and the carbon neutrality that a lot of transport organizations are looking to see. But also we're seeing a huge shift from air being the primary mode of pharma shipment to now organizations really focusing on the ocean environment to drive that carbon footprint. There's the technical standard from a WHO GDP guidance that is out there, but it's not universally adopted. So there is a gap in the universal technical standards in relation to quality and distribution for pharmaceutical companies. Also, I think that freight rates in general, I mean, the pandemic has further amplified this, but the cost of shipments is dramatically increasing, which I think allows you to naturally, once transportation operational cost, people start to cut quality cost. So here what we're trying to do is see if there's a mechanism with that cut of quality cost and spend, can we join up efforts to tackle quality in managing GDP through the supply chain. There's varying cold chain infrastructure. I would say there's a strong duplication of efforts where each individual pharmaco or each individual logistics firm is trying to assess and manage the GDP compliance, which is ultimately a waste of time, effort, and resource at the end of the day. And then finally, I think a focus on GDP will hopefully eliminate ultimate security vulnerabilities related to diversion, pharma ending up in the wrong market, or ultimately counterfeiting as well. So we're seeing some quite significant changes in the industry, and some age-old problems not going away is how I describe it. Those two things that are really driving change and why we're embarking on this. So Alan, if you want to go over how COVID is further amplified.
Okay, thanks, Courtney. Now, hardly an elephant in the room, because one of the biggest drivers of change, of course, continues to be COVID-19 and its effects. The pandemic has shown what it is possible when mankind faces larger scale danger and disruption, because suddenly barriers to collaboration crumble, innovative ideas emerge, and the impossible becomes the possible. We see it in times of war, and we're seeing it today in the face of the pandemic. Next slide. Right now, the whole pace and culture of business is undergoing a massive transformation as it adjusts to a new business paradigm. But the pandemic is not only a disaster, it's an opportunity and a turning point. We must take the opportunity to harness these circumstances, this almost unprecedented catalyst for change, in order to push supply chain reforms. Courtney?
Courtney, you're on mute.
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Thank you.
Restart.
Great. So I think what we've just covered is the drivers and the market landscape of the regulation, the problems and challenges that we're experiencing. Now we're here to talk about what is it that we've gathered here today to learn and get involved in. And as Alan mentioned, we've shortened it to MMCS, but what we have partnered BSI and Poseidon to do is really look at the pharma industry and the entire distribution chain and look how GDP multi-mode. And what we mean by that, just to clarify, is allowing not just an air freight shipment or just an ocean shipment, but the connection between all of the chains of custody within the transport logistics supply chain. That we want to create a compliance, standards, and training program that brings consistency, certainty, and then ultimately everyone driving together towards a continuous improvement model that allows us as an industry to meet the international quality and regulatory standards, but also make sure that we're collaboratively trying to drive significant change given the backdrop of COVID and the age-old problems that we've been experiencing for many years in this supply chain fragmentation. So what we're trying to do is join up forces, and a little bit of insight into the program description is realistically a number of different points that we're trying to achieve. But what it comes down to is we're looking to standardize. So standardize the way companies take the GDP legislation and create processes, products, and systems off the back of that. So can we create an industry standard that actually takes into account the GDP legislation, but makes it actionable so that we can actually assess compliance against it? Also, I would say that from a supply chain audit and a continued measure of improvement, is there a way we can join up forces on actually auditing as one? So pharma companies coming together to audit a single logistics provider, the results are fed back to the pharma organizations, and the GDP audit exercise is carried out one time, but everyone gets to see the results and also gets to track the continuous improvement. So instead of wasting time and effort on the audit or assessment exercise, we're actually working towards driving improvement. I've mentioned this before, but the whole digital atmosphere, how do we make sure that sharing of information, sharing of assessment results, sharing of the standards, sharing of training can actually be done through a digital format? So that is an element we're exploring there. And also how to make sure that the black hole of the supply chain, that I colloquially will call it, but that last mile distribution, we want to not just solve GDP more generally, but also make sure it gets all the way to where the patient ultimately receives the medicines or the drugs, which I think pharma companies are really struggling with how to understand that. And with a better GDP collaborative program, we believe that can happen.
Okay, thanks, Connie. The most obvious key attribute of the MMCS program is that it is multi-mode in scope. We recognise that pharma logistics needs to be much more resilient going forwards, and for safety and efficiency reasons, it is vital that the associated GDP compliance is conducted in a joined up way across different transport modes. And it's not only the case that GDP compliance just needs to be harmonised across different modes of transport, because the entire value network will benefit from subscribing to a common compliance framework. And here on the screen, you can see a simplified logistics scenario where all the actors in the distribution process have access to a comprehensive compliance support system, including common standards and universal audits, as Courtney has mentioned. Courtney.
Yeah, and just before we move on, Alan, just a comment from my side there is, well, I'm getting a echo. I'm sorry, that the point of that multi-mode comment is I'll call something out around the GDP certificate and the CEIV that is available through IATA, which serves a focused purpose. I'm getting an echo for some reason. Bear with me one moment. Okay, great. I think we should be good there. So what the multi-mode, so in the airline industry, we have IATA and we have the CEIV program, but where we're seeing a very big shift in the pharma industry is the fact that read any of the strategic reports or annual reports of the pharma co's right now, they're all looking to target to shifting to ocean freight by 2030 and beyond. So that shift in the market shows a very strong need to put a compliance mechanism in place across all nodes within the supply chain, not just in a single transport arm, which is the air freight currently. So this is where we're looking to not replace, but instead to design something that is more comprehensive. And again, using the chat box, I'd welcome some thoughts that you may have on that multi-mode aspect there. The other aspect I would say, just to go on with what is this program that we're looking to achieve, we are looking to achieve and make it global. So BSI is offices in 70 plus countries. We have operations that manage across 195 countries annually, delivering assessment and training programs. So what we want to do is not just have GDP legislation being managed or enforced in the EU or in the UK or in the US, but in fact, even where there's an absence of legislation globally, we want to apply this so that we're raising the standards to level the playing field. Also, a comment on standards. I mean, again, BSI is the national standards body. One of the things we often see when regulation comes down is that regulation will be adopted and enforced in very different ways. So one of the ways to overcome that, I would say, regulation complexity. So you have the EU has adopted the WHO guidance, but actually within the EU, the different national regulatory authorities have decided or not decided to adopt the GDP legislation and then enforce it. So how do a company then determine what legislation or what standard they need to adhere to or to implement? I think the way to do that is through an internationally accepted standard. And so one of the areas we're looking to explore within the MMCS program is, would we as a group be interested in taking the GDP legislation and putting it into a standard format that is internationally accepted? And that is one of the components that we are looking to achieve here. Alan, expand upon standardization for us. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry, Alan. Alan, you're on mute. Sorry. There you go.
Is that okay? Okay, standardization is the application of standards, and the classic case that you can see in the screen is the intermodal container. The steel shipping boxes that became popular after the Second World War, but weren't actually dimensionally harmonized globally until the late 1960s. Since then, of course, they have completely revolutionized cargo transportation. But we won't go down the Suez Canal road at the moment. In terms of the standardization of pharma-logistics, the more that can be done to normalize the products and processes concerned, the easier and cheaper it will be to adhere to and exceed the GDP regulations. And I say exceed because you've got to bear in mind that the regulations are all just the minimum acceptable standards. But of course, not everything can be standardized, just like not every item can be accommodated into a standard shipping container. But the current pharma freight system of countless bespoke solutions to essentially achieve the same thing is not only illogical, but unsustainable. And from standardization, you get simplification. You don't have to look very far to find a complex process which has been simplified, at least from a user's perspective, to tremendous effect. And a classic and contemporary example from logistics, of course, is Amazon. The recently retired Jeff Bezos, at just 57 years of age, he made himself the world's richest man through an obsession with improving the customer experience and a quick, safe, no-stress internet buying process. The logic behind Amazon's simplification business model applies every bit as much to pharmaceutical logistics, where the complexity and fragmentation of the logistics machine can only be controlled through a consensus approach and the judicious application of enabling technologies. As Mr. Bezos found, the rewards can be enormous.
And not just simplifying or standardizing, but harmonizing, I think, is also key. I've touched on it already. There, as a global organization, and anyone that is operating a pharma logistics supply chain will very much understand that they will experience different levels of harmonization of this GDP regulation. So, you know, we've mentioned the WHO, ICH actually putting out this guidance to industry around GDP, but right now that is the most macro level. But to actually get consistency on a country level or on a global level, even when you're rolling out a GDP compliance program, there really needs to be some harmonization of an operational rollout of GDP compliance. And that harmonization of bottom-up approach is where we get into play. So what we're looking to do is roll up our sleeves here, harmonize our efforts, and really understand how we can put together a comprehensive GDP assessment and training program in order to drive the industry to be more efficient, but also more harmonized in how they take on quality, which is one of the bare requirements of moving through this supply chain. And also, I would just say, before I turn over to Alan around the neutral and independence pieces, Alan mentioned it, we, BSI, are a royally chartered organization. We are not-for-profit distribution, so the neutrality and the status of a national standards body means we are a consensus-based program. So the concept of having a neutral and independent third parties in Poseidon and BSI, and I'll let Alan talk to the Poseidon piece, is that realistically we're able to take this neutral and independence and do good for the market, and this market is pharma quality and supply chain.
Yes, I would just like to endorse that by saying that the validity of regulatory compliance and supply chain standardization is contingent on the complete and demonstrable impartiality, objectivity and freedom of vested interest of all the parties involved, whether that be in guiding, monitoring or assessing conformity or in the development of standards. Team Poseidon, as a neutral trustee party, is a completely independent body.
So I guess we're starting to touch on that just now with the kind of why we feel up for this challenge, why BSI and Poseidon have decided to join forces, hopefully with you as part of this industry group, to bring together our expertise and really come up with a concrete, simple, but harmonized solution for us to tackle pharma logistics quality. So the first is, I would say, generally between our two organizations, we have a really strong understanding and have been playing in the pharma logistics space for a number of years between our two organizations. So we understand distribution routes, we understand chain of custody with different transportation nodes. We know what supply chain risk management looks like and what methodology can be used to deploy for GDP. We also have the kind of international standards expertise and a management system framework, which ultimately GDP is. It's a management system framework that happens to be regulation to govern and manage distribution. I think BSI hopefully brings that whole compliance and certification program development experience. We've worked with industries like pharma logistics for many different types of certification or compliance programs historically. So I feel up for the job here. We also have expert consultants who can help us along the journey in some of the key risk areas outside of just GDP to make sure we're incorporating it quite holistically. And finally, I would say the global footprint of having assessors on the ground, allowing that compliance or supply chain assessments to ongo and happen. We can leverage these as a part of a pilot to this formation of this MMCS program. And then finally, I think the market impartiality and competition safeguards stemming from that neutral and independent status that we both have as organizations allows us to really have this experience in coordinating multi-party networks and multi-collaboration. And I think, again, the two organizations between BSI and Poseidon are well suited with this, I'll call it the exact subject matter expertise, core and quality management, but also that neutrality and independence. So Alan, further to you for the unique value proposition, if I may.
Yes, thanks, Courtney. Yes, so between Poseidon and BSI, we do really believe that we are offering a unique value proposition. On the screen, you'll just see a summary of the key attributes of the MMCS approach, some of which, of course, we've already touched on. I don't need to say any more about neutrality and independence, or indeed the multi-mode applicability of MMCS, which of course marks it out as an innovative and indispensable programme, which is a lot more than just a box-ticking certification exercise. But I'll be touching more about certification in a moment in any case. But finally, the unique value proposition of MMCS also stems from its sheer breadth of content, and this is going to be underpinned with a highly secure digital substructure.
Brilliant. So we've talked a little bit now about the goals or the purpose of why BSI and Poseidon coming in. Now we're really looking at the program's purpose. What are we trying to achieve here together as a group, and how do we then take that on? So the purpose, I hope you're now starting to gather. And again, I'd welcome you to use the chat box with any questions that you may have on this topic. But the purpose has been conceived as a GDP compliance support program to fill a void in the market. Right now, there is not any organization or collaboration around GDP improvement within the pharma supply chain. So we're looking to fill the void in the market for a more universal, harmonized, and standards-driven approach to quality, allowing you to qualify and train in the distribution of vaccines and other medicines more effectively. So that's the third parties you may contract with, but also, as we mentioned, hopefully saving cost, resource. And Alan, I know you'll expand upon that a bit more now.
Okay, well, one of the main purposes of the MMCS programme is to assist in the extraction of as much value and benefit as possible from the logistics quality process. And in this respect, the cost of quality, the COQ as it's called, is a measure of all the costs relating to the quality of a product and its adherence to regulatory and in-house standards, guidelines and expectations. A simple way of describing COQ, cost of quality, would be to say that it's the cost that would not be incurred if quality were perfect. Next slide. However, few pharma companies know what the cost of quality, or its inverse, the cost of poor quality, the COPQ, actually is, although there is a growing awareness of the cost impacts of non-compliance. But even where an attempt is being made to ascertain these costs, the data can be very nebulous due to widely varying corporate costing and cost allocation policies. So there are many reasons, including the motives shown on the screen, why the industry should be coming together to optimise the quality process, to reduce the cost of poor quality and to extract more value from the QA process. Estimates of the cost of poor quality, the COPQ, in the pharmaceutical sector range from 25% to as much as 40% of turnover and up to 40% of operating expenses. Now, this compares to other quality-driven industries such as semiconductors, for example, which demonstrate only 48% of cost of poor quality. And others have estimated that pharma quality costs can be 3 to 6 times larger than profit levels, illustrating, in the words of one pharma commentator, that this is a huge opportunity that has been largely untouched thus far. Because as you can see, the hidden costs of poor quality, especially in the fragmented field of logistics, remain unacceptably and unnecessarily high.
Thanks, Alan. Great. So does this really make sense, everyone? I'm going to raise my hands like this woman does in this photo. Does this make sense to everyone? What we're trying to drive here? What we're going to play out here? Does it really make sense for each individual pharma company to be finding, assessing, and validating hundreds of carriers and suppliers? Does it make sense that each pharma company is developing and maintaining numerous in-house OQ and PQ test protocols? Does it make sense that each pharma company is designing multiple systems and product evaluation and qualification program for their third parties? Does it make sense that they're maintaining their own training programs for the ever-changing products and pack-out permutations? I mean, one quick story on the training programs. I was speaking to one of the global pharma innovator companies the other day. They have an entire qualification program they've had to set in place for training their staff to assess GMP and GDP. And they have a qualification renewal process. They don't share their training with any other pharma company. And you just imagine the cost of the maintenance of that ongoing training for your own staff versus if we draw together forces and doing it as a group. I feel like there would be much more rigor and much more advancement in the competency of individuals. I'm seeing as well with obviously the GDP requirement to do the distribution lane risk assessment. I'm seeing so many organizations producing large numbers of really discrete, quite insignificant, if I'm honest, lane validations that don't really prove that they're following GDP regulation. There's also too, I would say, the kind of multiple in-house SOPs and KPIs and creating their own digital systems to monitor compliance as well. So can we instead create an overarching system for us to share assessments and training so that we all have a view of what logistics firms are qualified, what pharma companies have adopted and are moving this forward? So to me, to answer the question, I don't think that makes sense. I don't think that makes sense, given what Alan just talked about of 40% of annual turnover of pharma companies spending on quality management. Does it really make sense that we're not collaborating in these areas, but instead individually wasting time, resource, and effort on all of these points? I don't think so. So I will ask you, if I may, with our second poll question, Ronnie. So expect a poll question to be popping up here. I would like to again ask you as the audience and hopefully participants in this moving forward is, do you think it would be useful to eliminate the duplication of efforts around GDP training and compliance and standards through this type of industry collaboration that we're talking about through MMCS? Very simple yes or no question here. Yes, you'd be open to exploring because again, we haven't figured it all out. It's not all there yet. We're trying to involve and engage so that we can go on this journey together. So yes, you'd be open to exploring, or no, believe that your program is thorough enough and it's also cost effective. So please, if you wouldn't mind answering that question through selecting A or B. Oh, that is very promising signs. There's a number of people, about 90% say that they'd be open to exploring this. So thank you all for that forwardness and also open to exploring the collaborative efforts that we're trying to embark here on with BSI and Poseidon in the MMCS program. So Alan, if I may, just turn it over to you back for the objectives of the program and outlining those.
Okay, thanks, Courtney. Well, ultimately, we all have the end goal of improving patient safety and patient outcomes, but this involves a complex synthesis of many different quality assurance factors, with adherence to GDP being just one part of the equation. The MMCS, as part of the overall compliance mix, has a number of overall goals, therefore, to make it relevant in a world of rapid change and disruption. Amongst these is the provision of GDP support and a logistics standardisation framework that is global, simplified, consistent, standardised, scalable, adaptable and affordable. Now, I've already touched on the need for the quality process to be one that adds value rather than cost, and often an investment in good quality will completely eclipse the costs of poor quality. For example, one recent study of pharma manufacturing demonstrated a more than 5-fold return on investment in quality improvements. And in the field of pharma-logistics, it's not hard to see, as another example, how a more standardised and integrated approach to GDP could eat into the massive costs inherent in the regulatory reporting, assessment and CAPA activities associated with temperature deviations, for example. Courtney.
Great, thanks, Alan. So, and then I guess what we want to make sure is very clear before we get into one layer deeper of the different program elements is what's in it for you. Whether you are part of a government, whether you're an insurance provider, whether you're a logistics firm, whether you're a pharma company or a shipper themselves, what's in it for you? And it's not just redundancy, elimination of excess resources. There's a number of benefits that we've outlined in participating in this collaborative effort. One is obviously the simplification, like we talked about, of the quality compliance processes, and not just from a shipper's perspective, I think, but also from a logistics firm perspective. I'm starting to see a lot of logistics companies starting to do assessments on their own subcontractors. So the chain is expanding. So before it expands too far, let's consolidate that in. And remove this huge amount of duplicated effort, repetition. I just feel so sorry for these companies that get audited and audited and audited and audited, or trained, but only once. And that's something we're trying to solve here. We want to try to incorporate and introduce a much more focused introduction of standardization in this process as well, from a process, a product, and a system. But ultimately, again, focusing on GDP as the core here, because we don't want to try to take into account everything you do as a business, but focusing on the GDP regulation and how you're maintaining that competency and compliance there. Again, I think ultimately you're going to get the regulator off your back. We've done a program like this with another industry company that is highly regulated, or industry sector that is highly regulated, and they have drawn so much attention in their collaboration of compliance on the third-party suppliers that in fact the regulator has now acknowledged this consortium as best practice and actually has started to ask for the consortium to audit on behalf of the regulator because they trust in the collaboration so strongly. So I think ultimately it may lead into a higher number of quality or regulatory a reduction in the number of non-conformities, excuse me. Also, I think it gives a common reference point for continuous improvement. I know you guys know this better than even I, but the landscape of maturity within the pharmacos and also within the logistics supply chain, it is all over the place as it relates to capability, but also the ability to take on improvement and drive that forward. A lot of people are just ticking a box to just tick a box rather than driving improvement. And if we remove the kind of compliance, and you can then focus on driving the improvement. And ultimately, I think it's just going to make it way more seamless in the way that we integrate this process across the industry and making it more holistic. So a number of advantages, I hope, that are starting to answer, what is in it for you? These are the areas that I think are in it for you. So Alan, if you don't mind just kicking off some of the main program elements for us.
Okay, thank you, Connie. Right, next slide. Here you can see the main building blocks of the MMCS program, and these elements are all being developed and harmonized using an industry consensus approach such as we've described, and of which this introductory workshop forms the starting point. So we're now going to take a closer look at some of these blocks. Courtney.
Great. So to start us off with technical standards. Technical standards obviously being, like we mentioned, not just a guidance document or a piece of regulation that's been pushed out by a regulator, but instead, what does it actually mean? And to me, the absence of a universal technical standard is one of the main growing impediments to driving sustained improvement across the pharma logistics sector. So one of the first components that we have thought through, and I would even be bold enough to say would recommend us exploring as a part of this first endeavor, is to look at bringing you all into a room and embarking on a consensus-based GDP standard, which can take different shapes and forms. We're not precious about what the output is, but we know there is a need to really develop this universal technical standard that's currently not in place. And I hope, again, with the infrastructure as the national standards body under BSI, we could potentially be an easy, direct route that can very easily spin up a standard in less than 3 months' time now with our agile nature. So again, just kind of testing appetite, if I may, from the audience and participants in the working group. So would you find the next poll question coming in, if you may, yes or no answer, would you find that the creation of an internationally accepted standard reflecting and representing GDP legislation would be useful to allowing more adherence to or maintaining compliance to GDP requirements? Either yes, the inconsistent GDP regulation is too complex to follow internationally, or no, the WHO GDP guidance is enough. So I'd welcome your thoughts here on whether you think this internationally accepted standard would be of use, please. We've got still some numbers coming in, so we'll just wait a moment here, please. Great. Good representative debate, I'd say. We've got about 75%, so 3/4, saying that yes, it would be helpful, and the inconsistent regulation is hard to follow, and you'd be interested in kind of this internationally accepted standard, or no, actually the guidance is enough. So we've got 25% representing the no and 75% representing the yes. So seems like, again, there may be appetite to explore this internationally accepted standard. So thanks for your feedback there. Again, I'd welcome continuing participation from your side. So the next section of the MMCS program that we're looking at is an audit. Call it audit, call it assessment, call it compliance, whatever you want to call it. We're not precious about the word either, because we know everyone uses different word: audit, certificate, assessment. What we're talking about here is very much a standard assessment scheme that is an important element to the MMCS program to allow for there to be an industry recognized GDP compliancy status. Instead of being, I would say, the master-slave relationship that is right now, where the masters, which are the pharmacos, just audit and audit and audit and audit the logistics firms year on year on year without any follow-up, without any real drive to improvement. So there isn't a way really to have that industry recognized compliancy status. And I think a universal audit or assessment program will allow us to achieve that. So there are kind of two options that we're looking at here. We're, again, not precious about which option or both that end up shaping out of the back of this MMCS program, but would like your input into this around, are we looking at a compliance audit for the supply chain where you have, 70 questions based on this technical standard we develop, and you get a 70% compliant and 2 raised non-conformities, and that compliance is then up to the shipper to determine how they want to improve that supplier? Or another option is we actually kind of do a more pass-fail continuous improvement around certification, where you either achieve certification through ongoing surveillance audits that maintain that certificate for the shipper and pharmacos, or also for the logistics firms themselves. But I'll just really quickly here, because I know we're moving with pace, is just we've done this before, again, for several different industry sectors, and this alignment of sharing audits or sharing assessments. So I guarantee you, well, I know that there are only certain logistics companies that have the capability to ship pharma or to ship vaccine medicines. There are only a certain number. So you are all the shippers are using the same suppliers. All the pharmacos are using relatively the same logistics firms with some geographic tweak to that, right? Or differentiation. So imagine if we were able to say there is one assessment, and you can see this on the slide in the middle, one audit exercise, one training program that sits between the shipper and the supply chain. And if we were able to publicize the audit results or the certificates and publicize the training results, so that through a neutral and secure way, the shipper that works with that logistics company can see that individual logistics firm's results, their certificate, their audit results, their training results, so that it is a fully transparent way of ensuring the logistics firms are showing compliance to the shippers, but also the shipper is able to then show the regulator ultimately that they are maintaining the GDP compliance. So we already have between BSI and Poseidon this clearinghouse reference, this sharing platform. We've already got it established. It's been tried and tested in 2 or 3 different industry sectors with a very similar problem statement that we're experiencing in the pharma supply chain. So we not only are thinking it's possible, we know it's possible, we just need you to come along the ride for us. So one of the areas of MMCS is very much around the sharing of audit and sharing of training, and in a combined approach to doing so.
Okay, thanks, Courtney. I'll take over at this point because I said earlier that I would have a few words to say about certification, and they're perhaps controversial words because certification is a bit of a bee in my particular bonnet for various reasons. And what I want to say is that although certification schemes have an important role in raising standards, of that there's no doubt, many of the schemes that you see out there in industry are far from perfect and are delivering questionable results. In fact, industry is littered with failed or poor certification schemes. I could give you many examples. The Red Tractor scheme in the UK food sector, the Marine Stewardship Council fisheries scheme, the FSC forestry industry scheme, the Kimberley Diamond Certification Scheme, even IATA CIV certification programme, they've all attracted criticism recently. And why is this? It's because such schemes can be questionable because they often instill a false sense of security. They can sometimes encourage workarounds and window dressing, and they're frequently associated with high conformance costs. And most importantly of all, they're often ridden with conflicts of interest. So although certification can be useful and necessary, it does have its limitations, and this is certainly an area we would like to cover in our consultation process. Those of you out there who feel the same way as I do or have different views, we want you to share them so that we can come up with the right solutions and build certification into the MMCS programme correctly. But the question I'm just asking, and I'd be very interested in getting feedback in this, perhaps we should have had a poll on it, is are we coming up against the inherent limitations of certification schemes? And I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to make that particular point. So we're moving on now to the training part of block of the programme, and training and education at managerial, operational, enterprise and individual levels will all be fundamental parts of the MMCS programme. Next. Most of the courses will be conducted through the well-established BSI Training Academy, which Courtney touched on a few moments ago. And this is a global reach and trains no less than 200,000 plus people every year with an unrivaled portfolio of courses. Now, training in the MMCS project will be available in a range of formats to suit different needs and circumstances. In terms of depth and breadth, some course examples are shown on the screen, but we're very keen again to explore your needs and suggestions in this area. So please give us your thoughts about training, give us an insight into your needs, tell us what works, tell us what doesn't work, and we'll accommodate your views in MMCS.
Great, thanks, Alan. Appreciate that. So, I mean, we're going into our second to last poll, I suppose. We still have one more for you. So this poll is asking about, do you agree with the inclusion of all component parts of the MMCS program? So we've talked about an internationally accepted standard creation. We've talked about a GDP shared assessment model. We've talked about training programs that need to be in place, as well as we mentioned digital technology to support as the foundation to all of these component parts. So the question I have for you is, and it's okay to say yes, or it's okay to say no. But yes, you feel like all 3 or 4 of those components are relevant and worthwhile. No, you think that you don't need all of those parts. Or C, no, you're missing a critical part. And if you believe that we're missing a critical part, I'd also encourage you to inform us in the chat box as to what you believe is missing. But I'd welcome your we're about an hour in. What is your agreement in the inclusion of all the parts in place here? Yes, they're relevant. No, not all of them are relevant. Or no, we're missing something, please. Oh, good. Well, we had one vote for missing critical part. So I'd welcome a dialogue one-on-one. Please feel free to reach out to us or get involved with the next steps. But we got a lot of responses, about 80–90% of them were all saying yes, the program components were all relevant. So again, good to hear that we're kind of on the right trajectory with our thought process and our thinking, but again, not fully shaped or formed. It's very much up to us to drive it forward as a group here, as a. So what does this mean? I guess we're getting to the point towards the conclusion now. We're looking at kind of a roadmap forward, and the roadmap forward very much is up to us to drive together. So we are looking to kind of launch the formal program itself in the collaboration with the industry from autumn time. So call it after everyone goes on nice summer holidays and the end of July and August, we'll all get back together come September. And the goal that we're wanting to try to do is make sure we've confirmed the project in its form and go to the right to really look to develop the program elements. But once we have the confirmation of the program, hopefully, we will look to develop relationships, configure an organizational structure, create the program, and maintain the industry engagement. So we're looking at that phase 1 to be launched. And then once we get that industry engagement, we're then taking it to develop these program elements, which are, like we mentioned, the training, the standard assessment, and then the sustainability drivers that you can write back on with proof of concept there. So as Alan mentioned at the beginning, we've got this mapped and to our first recorders and the program elements. So first defining the scope, timeline, the relationship and organizational structure. We're looking already now at creating this awareness and courting industry engagement. So please consider yourselves courted. We would love you to be a part of this endeavor with us. We're looking to then develop the program elements. So like I mentioned earlier, rolling up our sleeves, getting our hands dirty together to really understand how we drive this forward. But it is still, you can see, high level at this stage because we are reliant on your involvement in driving this with us. So at this stage, the roadmap is at a high level, but Alan, if you just wouldn't mind emphasizing the importance of industry dialogue and consultation one step further.
Yes, absolutely. This is what this is all about. And I'll just mention the fact that we will be duplicating this particular introductory session in a timescale to suit the Asian market in a few weeks' time after the summer break, so that they can have the same input that the audience today has. So that's just for everyone's information. But for the purposes of this industry consultation, we are planning to establish what we call a market liaison committee, comprising representatives from a broad spectrum of stakeholders to advise on the programme and ensure it maintains its ecumenical status. And this MLC will comprise stakeholder focus groups to ensure that all relevant parties and geographical interests and locations have a say. And you'll find out in a moment how you can register your own interest in this.
Great. So this is the all question. So we'll look at kind of driving this last poll question to hopefully gauge involvement moving forward. So after hearing the full overview of the MMCS program led by Poseidon and BSI, would you be interested in participating in its development? Yes, you are interested. B, you may be interested, but need to understand time commitment, or C, no, not at this time. So if I can just ask for everyone to start to answer, yes, you're interested in helping us along this journey and taking it forward in partnership, in collaboration. B, you may be interested, or C, not at all, not at this time. Great. I've given you a maybe answer. That's always the best one when we don't know where we want to go. So it looks like we've got about 40% of saying yes, they are interested in taking this forward with us. I appreciate that commitment. About 50 or so percent saying that they may be interested, and just around 12% saying no, not at this time, not interested. So looks like we've got some definite interest, and then also some interest if we were able to relay back to you kind of the time and commitment that would be required. So that's really our last poll question of the day. What we're here now, Alan, I guess, is just around the feedback and questions from the group.
Okay, thanks, Courtney. Well, that's what we're looking for right now. But just before we look at the incoming questions that we've received, because we've got a little bit of time to deal with those. Yes, I want to just point out this registration process. There is a system that's in place online to register your interest, and this is no commitment required. This is just to make sure that you receive updates on the programme as it develops, to make sure you're invited to any future workshops, to get an invite to the official programme launch when it comes along later this year, to get your copy of the MMCS programme prospectus, which is a written summary of what we've discussed today, and other documents, and including a copy of this presentation if that's what you would like. And then it will also give you the opportunity of serving on the MMCS Market Liaison Committee and having the opportunity to be involved in the programme and any future programme pilots that we may run. So it really is worthwhile registering on this. As I say, there's no commitment, but it tells us who is interested, who we should be engaging with, who we should be in contact with, and who we should keep in touch with